Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere you've never been upward, through layers of silence, past the breath of stars, into a place where heaven still hums, with the stories too dangerous, too gentle, or too sacred for earthly ears. You are not walking, you are floating, not in a dream but in a realm where dreams are considered history. Light here doesn't shine, it remembers. Your feet are nowhere, and your name echoes softly like someone calling it through a veil. You drift past a feather that weighs more than stone, past a gate that opens for those who no longer need it, and past the edges of memory itself. This is where forgotten parables live. You probably won't survive this, unless you've got wings or a direct line to the Almighty. Luckily tonight you have both. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also let me know in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it right now? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You ascend slowly, not with effort, but invitation. The skies don't push you, they part like they've been waiting for you. You pass through a layer of warmth like golden breath, and it feels like being remembered. Angels glide in the far distance, not with harps, not with swords, just presence. Some nod toward you not because you're holy, but because they recognize the question hovering in your spirit. What didn't we hear? You're brought to a place that looks like a library and smells like a mountain. Scrolls float, stones hum. There are no books, only memory stitched into space. You step into a glowing circle and suddenly Christ is there, not walking toward you, not turning, just already there. His eyes carry galaxies, but he's barefoot, and he speaks. Not aloud, not in words, but you know he's telling you stories. Stories never told in church, never written in red-letter Bibles. These are the teachings whispered across eternity's shoulder, too wild for doctrine, too tender for pulpits. He begins with a place, Heaven's Gate. Not pearly, not gold, it's something else entirely. It looks like a swing hanging from nothing. You sit, and you listen. He says, there was once a coin that gathered no dust, not because it was hidden, but because it never rested. It passed from palm to palm, never clutched, never hoarded. A widow used it to buy bread for a neighbor. That neighbor gave it to a carpenter as a thank you. The carpenter gave it to a child for a toy, and the child gave it to God. You furrow your brow. Coins can't reach God. But Christ just smiles because this one did. He continues, that coin never lost its value because it was never asked to prove it. And that's when you realize some treasures are made sacred, not by where they end up, but by how they never stop moving in love. He tells you more. About a shepherd who once locked his gate at night not to keep wolves out, but to keep the lost sheep in. Some say he murmurs that this was mercy. Others call it a mistake. A breeze ruffles your thoughts. Heaven doesn't require you to believe. It only invites you to notice. You begin to see the sky differently now, each star, a parable never spoken, each constellation, a metaphor too poetic for parchment. And Christ leans in just a little. Do you know why some stories weren't recorded? He asks. You shake your head. Because they weren't meant to be preached. They were meant to be remembered. In sleep, in sorrow, in silence. You hear bells that don't ring. You see doors that open into music. And you understand heaven doesn't hide its truths. It hides you until you're ready to see them. Some believe this entire realm is metaphor. Others think it's memory echoes of things the soul always knew before flesh made it forget. But tonight you don't debate, you drift. Because now Christ has taken your hand. And where he leads next isn't a place, it's a parable. It starts with a coin, yes, but not the one you just heard about. This one was never found. And yet, it changed everything. You drift beside him now, not on clouds, not on air, but on knowing. The kind of knowing that doesn't come from study or sermons, but from something much quieter. A recognition in your spirit like a story long ago whispered into your bones. He pauses beside a tree that glows from the inside. Its roots drink from light, not water. Its leaves do not rustle, they breathe. And from one of its lower limbs, something swings slowly. It is not fruit, it is not fire, it is a coin. Polished smooth by time, worn thin by touch. You reach for it, but Christ places his hand over yours, not to stop you, but to say wait. And then he begins the parable. There was once a woman who lost a coin, he says. Not to the cracks in her home, but to the folds of her heart. It wasn't misplaced, it was given up. It had been spent on someone who never said thank you. You listen closely. You've heard this story before, haven't you? She swept her house, tore apart her linens, upturned jars, called on angels, lit a lamp. You nod. Yes, the parable of the lost coin, Luke's gospel. But then Christ smiles again the way he does when you've only heard the surface. She found the coin, he continues, but she didn't pick it up. Wait. She knelt beside it, wept over it, and then she whispered, "You don't belong to me anymore." The coin shimmered, then vanished. She never held it again, Christ says. But heaven recorded her gesture, not the finding, the letting go. You breathe in slowly. This version was never read to you in Sunday school. The dustless coin, he explains, was never stored, never praised, never tucked away in a temple. It was always moving, always unnoticed, always spent in love. The coin was pure, not because it was found, but because it was never used to buy something for the self. Sometimes he murmurs, God doesn't want your treasure. He wants your release. That coin, the one she let go of, became light in someone else's darkness, an answer to a prayer she'd never hear. You look back up at the tree. The coin swinging there no longer glows. It fades softly, turning to mist. It never needed to be held. A breeze passes behind you, not cold but sacred, and Christ says something gently strange. You were once that coin. You blink. What? You were given, you were spent, you were lost, but not forgotten, not once. You look down at your hands, and for a moment they are shimmering silver. Not because you're valuable, but because you were part of someone else's parable. You begin to understand. Not all lost things are meant to be found. Some are meant to transform. A soft laugh escapes him. You probably thought this would be all harps and halos, huh? You smile in spite of yourself. He sits beside you now, and time folds in like the wings of a resting dove. There's more, of course. A whole vineyard waits. But not the one you're expecting, not one of thorns or drunken joy, not one bounded by walls. This vineyard has no boundary at all, and no guard. And that Christ says was the problem. Another parable he tells you, never written down, but it happened. Right after I left the crowd, right before Gethsemane. You lean closer. There was a vineyard that bore no grapes. Odd beginning. It was planted not for harvest, but for rest. A place people wandered into, found shade, peace. A place with no owner, or so it seemed. Travelers came, laid down, prayed, laughed, left. But one day someone stayed. He tried to tend the vines, water the roots, prune the branches, and in doing so, he claimed it. Built a wall, wrote rules, called himself a steward. And others followed. He decided who could enter and who could not, who could rest and who must earn it. And so Christ says with a sigh, the fruitless vineyard became a temple, not of grapes, but of judgment. You look into his eyes. What happened to it? He looks skyward. The wall was knocked down by a child, a barefoot one. She just wanted to play. Another smile, another untold parable. Some believe this refers to early believers who took the message of rest and made it religion. Others think it's about your own soul, the way you try to gate your joy, regulate your peace. But he doesn't explain. He just lets you listen. Because this journey isn't for debate. It's for returning. And you're not here to learn like a student, you're here to remember. From a coin that moved to a vineyard that rested, you start to see these were never rules. They were rhythms. And you're starting to move to the music again. The ground beneath you shifts not with force, but like sand giving way to memory. Christ walks beside you now, though neither of you leave footprints. You're moving forward, and yet everything feels like it's circling gently inward, toward a center you can't yet see. Ahead, the land opens into rows of green, a vineyard just as he promised, but not quite. There are no fences, no gate, no watchtower. The vines grow as they please, twisting like they're dancing, reaching sideways more than upward. Grapes hang here and there, but they don't seem harvested. Some are ripe, others are not. No one is picking, no one is working. No one except one man. He's sitting in the middle of the vineyard, not standing, not walking, just sitting calmly like a child listening to the hum of insects in the sun. He wears a servant's robe tied but faded, and he doesn't move even as birds flutter near his hands. You turn to Christ, and he begins. There was once a servant, he says, hired to tend a field. He was given tools, instructions, a schedule. But when he saw the vineyard, something shifted in him. You glance at the man, he still doesn't move. He put down the tools, took off the burden of time, and sat. You wait for the twist, was he lazy, rebellious? But Christ continues, others passed by, saw him resting, judged him, reported him. But the master of the vineyard came. One evening saw the servant still sitting there and said only this, you understood. You blink, understood what? That the field didn't need tending, Christ says. It needed presence. A soft joke falls from his lips. It's hard to explain to people who love productivity, isn't it? You chuckle because it's true. You've measured your worth in progress steps checklists. But here, heaven shows another scale. You see, he whispers, some of my teachings weren't about doing. They were about being. Stillness is not laziness when the soul is listening. You look back at the servant. He catches your gaze and smiles. Not with pride, not with invitation, just joy. Quiet, anchored joy. There are parables Christ says that humans rewrite without meaning to. You nod, like the one where the servant was always running, always working. But here he's sitting. Heaven rewrites it differently. And the fruit you ask, what about the harvest? Christ looks up, there's fruit. But not every field is for picking, some are for breathing. And somehow that makes sense. Theologically, it causes tension. Some might say, but Scripture says the harvest is plentiful. Others might argue idle hands aren't holy hands. But here now, none of that sticks. The air is too gentle for arguments. And then Christ leans slightly toward you. There was a reason I never told this one aloud, he murmurs. They would have crucified me faster. You half laugh, half gasp. People want purpose, but rest confuses them, especially when it looks divine. A dragonfly lands on your shoulder. It's blue, but when it flutters, its wings show glimmers of Scripture. Just one line, be still and know. The rest fades. You ask, was this servant rewarded? Christ considers. He was remembered. That was enough. Another twist. Heaven often rewards by remembering. As you walk deeper into the vineyard, the vines begin to hum, not with music, but memory. You hear the sounds of prayers whispered in sleep, of laughter from forgotten days, of songs sung to God in empty churches. You ask if the vineyard stores them? Christ replies it is them. You pause. The field is made of remembrance, he explains. Every vine a story God never forgot. Every grape a moment too small for history, but too holy to lose. One vine nearby pulses softly. Christ gestures. Touch it. You do. And suddenly you see a woman singing to her dying child with no one around. A boy giving his only bread to a bird with a broken wing. An old man smiling at a star through tears no one saw. And then it fades. You step back. Heaven remembers what earth forgets. Christ's tone softens even more. That's why some parables were never spoken. They were lived. They grew here. The servant is now gone. Or maybe you moved past him, or maybe you were him. Christ points forward, ready for the next one. You nod a little breathless. He warns it's about an angel, one who almost refused his task. You raise an eyebrow, because the message was too gentle. And he thought it wouldn't be believed. Was it, you ask? Christ's eyes twinkle. That's for you to decide. The vineyard fades behind you, not with finality, but like a dream you've finished dreaming. Your footsteps, if they are footsteps, carry you across a landscape made of hush. Not silence exactly, but the hush that follows divine whispering. Christ walks ahead this time. You follow. A shimmer appears in the sky above, not a star, not a bird, something in between. And then he speaks again gently. There was an angel once who was given a parable to carry. One of mine. One I never spoke aloud. You watch the shimmer grow brighter, but he hesitated, Christ says. Not because he doubted me, but because the parable was too soft. He feared no one would take it seriously. You ask, what was it about? Christ answers stillness, again, but this time, inside the storm. The shimmer descends, forming not a being of wings and might, but a figure cloaked in translucence. Its eyes reflect you, and Christ, and every version of you that's ever prayed with clenched fists. The angel doesn't speak. He came to a prophet, Christ explains, one who had been beaten by visions, tired of divine riddles. The prophet asked for power, a weapon, or fire. Instead, this angel handed him a story. You listen closely. It was about a woman in a city who walked every day to a fountain that never ran dry, Christ begins. She never prayed aloud, never wept, never asked. She just walked, every morning, every evening, through chaos, through war, through silence, through miracles. She walked. To her, the fountain was not holy, he continues. It was simply dependable. One day her city burned, but she still walked. The fountain still poured. And when the fires died, others noticed her. They asked how she had survived. She said, only I kept walking to the water. You blink. That's it. Christ smiles, that's it. No healing touch, no angelic choir, no thunder from heaven, just faith in motion, unannounced, unapplauded. And the prophet, you ask? Christ nods toward the angel. He didn't understand at first. He wanted signs, not subtleties. But the angel told him she was the sign. The figure before you kneels not to you, but in humility to the memory. You feel something shift. That woman, like she existed, maybe still does. Maybe she's been you once or twice. But why did the angel hesitate? Because Christ says people want their parables loud, big, fiery. But this one, he lowers his voice. This one asks them to be faithful with no witnesses. You understand now? Some believe this story points to women in scripture overlooked by tradition, those whose faithfulness wasn't recorded. Others think it's about daily devotion that shapes eternity without ever trending. The angel rises, and you ask what happened to him. Christ smiles. He learned, eventually. He delivers quieter stories now, to sleepers, to children, to you. You blink, me. A soft laugh. You didn't think you came here alone, did you? The hush returns. You notice the angel's wings not feathered, not blazing, but woven with threads of old prayers, ones you forgot you said. Christ turns and you walk again, this time into a grove of olive trees. But something strange, these trees shine from the inside like secrets fermenting in bark. There was once a lamp, he says, made not to shine but to remind. You pause, remind of what? That light doesn't always mean victory. And now he begins again. The lamp that cursed the darkness. Already you sense this won't be a normal bedtime story. There was a man, Christ says, who forged a lamp from the remnants of an old idol. He thought by turning darkness into light, he could sanctify the past. You narrow your eyes, sounds noble. But every time the lamp lit, Christ continues, it made people arrogant. They used it to boast of their righteousness, to expose others, to shame, a light used for shame. And so he says the man buried it, deep beneath a fig tree. But the fig tree, he adds, stopped growing, because the lamp kept shining underground. You exhale. Even hidden, the light was changing things, warping roots, heating soil. And that, Christ says, is what happens when we force light into places God hasn't cleared yet. Some believe this parable is about religious pride, about the misuse of truth as a weapon. Others see it as commentary on early sects who judged too quickly in God's name. But here beneath glowing trees, no one is judging. Christ kneels, touches the soil. He says the man returned, dug it up. But this time, he didn't relight it. He carried it to the river and let it sink. Was that the end, you ask? Christ shrugs gently. The river still glows at night. A pause. That's not a threat, it's a mercy. And you realize some lights don't need extinguishing. They need redeeming. You think of truths you've wielded too sharply, then of gentleness you've ignored, then of those fig trees in your soul that stopped growing. The wind carries your thoughts upward. The angel is gone now, but you feel watched in a loving way. And Christ, as always, walks forward. There's one more tonight, he says. It's about a man who planted seed and then ate it. You almost laugh. Wait, isn't that missing the point? Christ just grins. You'd be surprised. The path ahead curves downward into a shallow valley blanketed in twilight. The trees here whisper though there's no wind. Their leaves curl inward like they're listening. You follow Christ into the hush, the scent of fig and wild honey trailing behind him. He pauses at a slope where small tufts of grain sway gently, their heads heavy with seed. But the field is patchy. Some stalks stand tall, others are broken at the root. A few places look disturbed, as if someone sat down and stayed there. Christ smiles, then points to one of those bare patches of earth. He sat here, he says softly. Who? The man who ate his seed? You settle beside him, and again the parable begins. There was once a farmer who received seed from heaven, he says. Pure, golden, overflowing with promise. You nod. So far it sounds familiar. He rejoiced, Christ continues. But instead of planting, he kept a portion aside just in case the soil failed him. Just in case heaven didn't send rain. A hedge against doubt. But then came hunger, Christ says. Not famine, not disaster. Just the slow, quiet ache of spiritual hunger. And instead of waiting, he crushed the seed, boiled it, ate. You blink, and the rest? He told no one, Christ replies. He walked the field every morning, pretending to inspect what he had never planted. A silence hangs. The man performed faith. The seasons passed, Christ says. Others bore fruit. Fields bloomed. And still he walked among empty rows, offering advice to sowers, while hiding the hollow in his own hand. You feel it then deep in your chest, that hollow. But Christ isn't condemning. Heaven knew, he says gently, and did not punish. Instead, one night the man dreamt. He stood in a garden, not his own, Christ says, and saw a tree bearing fruit shaped like teardrops. He reached for one, but it turned to seed in his hand. You ask, was it a second chance? Christ nods, but only if he chose not to eat it. This time the man did plant one seed and waited. You lean forward. Did anything grow? Christ doesn't answer with words. Instead, he parts the grass before you. Beneath it is a single sprout, tiny, vulnerable but rooted. That's his Christ whispers, the only one he didn't devour. Some believe this parable is about pastors who preach empty messages, having consumed the revelations meant to be shared. Others say it's about everyday believers who let fear override trust, spending their spiritual inheritance on short-term comfort. You think perhaps it's about you, and that's okay. Christ chuckles softly. The point wasn't shame, it was renewal. He looks up. Even broken soil remembers how to grow. You glance at the other bare patches. So, what now? He smiles wider. Now we meet the two fountains. And just like that, the valley changes. You are standing before two springs. One is crystal clear, pouring gently over smooth stones. The other is darker, not muddy, but deeper, as if holding ancient things beneath the surface. They're both from me, Christ says, but they do very different things. You kneel at the clear one first. It sparkles, refreshing your fingers like 1,000 tiny sighs. It sings almost a melody like childhood laughter. This, he says, is the truth that soothes. You turn to the darker spring. Its water is heavier. When you reach in, your skin tingles not in pain, but memory. This, he adds, is the truth that breaks. You glance at him. Breaks what? Pride, assumption, certainty, he answers, but it also breaks chains. You look between them. People love the first fountain, but most avoid the second. There was once a town, Christ says, that built its chapel between these two. The priest, new and well-meaning, invited only the first spring's water, for baptism, for blessing. It healed their wounds, he explains, but left their diseases. You pause. He avoided the darker spring because it caused confession, Christ says, and he thought peace was more important than transformation. Eventually, a woman quiet, ignored, drank from the deeper spring. And what happened? She wept, not from guilt, from release. She spoke truths she'd buried under decades of politeness. The village listened, and in her honesty, they found their own. So they changed, you ask. No, Christ replies, half did, half left. He watches your reaction. You realize even divine water doesn't guarantee unity. Some believe this parable is about churches that offer comfort without challenge. Others think it represents the balance between grace and truth, between reassurance and rebuke. But here now you see both springs for what they are, needed. You cup your hands. First you drink from the clear one, sweet, simple. Then from the deep. It tastes of salt and freedom. And just like that, your tongue knows words you've never said aloud. I've wasted years pretending, you whisper. Christ doesn't flinch. I didn't plant. I didn't drink deeply. He places a hand on your shoulder, but you're here now. And just like that, you remember the lamp buried in the fig tree. The angel who carried a story too soft for doctrine. The woman who kept walking to water. You ask, is all of this connected? His smile says yes. Then what comes next? He points to the shoreline just ahead. Something drawn in the sand, he says. And this one is about you. The terrain begins to flatten into a wide, soft shore. No crashing waves, no tides, just the quiet hush of water that barely moves, like it's listening for something older than sound. You walk beside Christ, and with every step, your feet grow lighter, not from effort, but release. It's as if the weight you didn't know you carried is slipping off with every grain of sand. A head etched into the shore like a line that refused to fade is a drawing. It isn't elaborate, just two curved lines forming a mirror shape, almost like parentheses that never closed. Christ kneels beside it and runs his finger along one arc. The sand doesn't move. The line remains. This was drawn once, he says quietly, by my hand, but no one saw it. You kneel beside him. It was on the same day I wrote in the dust, he adds. You remember that story? You nod. The woman caught in adultery, the accusing Pharisees, Christ stooping to write in the dirt. But the words were never recorded. Because they weren't words, he says. They were reflections. He gestures to the sand. What I drew that day wasn't a sentence, it was a mirror. You look again. The shape flickers just briefly and you see yourself in it. Not as you are now, but as you were, and as you're becoming. The mirror in the sand, he whispers. A parable not told but shown. He begins the story. There was once a teacher, Christ says, who met a man with many questions. The man brought scrolls, traditions, versus arguments. But the teacher drew only one shape. You glance down. The mirrored curves again. The man was confused. Christ continues. He said, "What is this?" The teacher replied, "It is how God sees you. You stare harder. The shape widens, stretches, and you realize it's incomplete, always open, never closed. He expected doctrine, Christ says, but he was given recognition. You ask softly, why not answer his questions? Christ brushes his hand along the other curve, because answers end things. Mirrors begin them. You feel something stir within you, an ache for clarity that begins to loosen. He went home confused, Christ says, but the next morning he looked in the water and finally wept. Why? Because he saw a face he'd never accepted as worthy of love. A long silence sits between you both. Some believe this story speaks to Nicodemus, who came to Jesus by night. Others see it as a lesson on inner transformation, how we demand rules, but heaven offers reflection. People want maps, Christ says, but I gave mirrors. He stands, and for a moment, so do you. You glance again at the lines in the sand, and now they glow faintly, not with heat or power, but memory. You step back. They vanish, but the reflection remains in your chest. As you walk further along the shore, something shimmers ahead, a door. No frame, no hinges, just a freestanding doorway in the middle of nowhere, glowing gently like it remembers where it used to be. Christ leads you to it. It opens backward, he says. You tilt your head. Backward? He nods. To go forward through it, you must release everything you brought. What if I forget who I am? He smiles. That's the point. You reach for the handle, but Christ stops you. Before you pass through, he says you should hear the story. You nod. There was once a merchant, Christ begins, who carried shame like treasure. Every failure, every lie, every cruelty, he remembered them all. Not to repent, but to feel in control. A strange kind of pride. He wore his guilt like armor, told himself it kept him humble, but really it kept him isolated. One day he found a door in a dream. No sign, no writing. Just the sense that he was meant to walk through, but when he turned the handle, Christ says the door opened toward him, not away. And when it did, every burden he'd been clutching was yanked from his grip. The door didn't lead to a place. It led to release. But he didn't step through, Christ says. He reached to pick up his burdens again. You wait, did he ever enter? Christ answers only after he stopped believing they were sacred. You inhale slowly. The salt air carries more than wind. It carries memory. Many think they need to bring their pain with them, Christ says. As proof, as currency. But the kingdom takes nothing but surrender. You turn back to the glowing doorway. Now it looks like light held in shape. And without thinking, you place your hand on the handle. It turns, effortless, and the door opens backward. A warm pull, like wind, like song, like a mother calling your name, reaches toward you. You step through, and just like that, the burden you've been carrying drops from your soul like sand from a robe. You don't even look back. Behind you, the door dissolves. And ahead, a pasture, but not for sheep. Not yet. Christ is already walking again. You catch up lighter, freer. You ready for the next, he asks. What is it? He grins. About a shepherd. You nod. The one who left the 99. No, he says. The one who made a mistake. Your brow furrows. Shepherds make mistakes. Christ nods solemnly, even the good ones. You walk beside him again, the shore behind you, dissolving into tall golden grass that shimmers without needing sunlight. The field ahead is quiet, not the silence of stillness, but the kind that follows when everyone has gone home. Christ leads you along a narrow ridge between two hills, and just before the rise you see it, a crook, lying in the grass, abandoned, worn smooth by hands that once clutched it tightly. He doesn't pick it up. You do. It feels warm, like memory. And then Christ begins. There was once a shepherd, he says, who counted 99 and left them. You know that story. You nod. The famous one, the beloved parable, the lost sheep. But this one is different, he says. This one isn't told. He points toward the far hill, because this shepherd thought the 99 were safe, and they weren't. You pause. What happened? He sighs gently. She knew her flock well, every hoof, every bleat, and when one wandered, she followed. You raise an eyebrow. He nods. Yes. This one was a woman. They rarely preach it that way, but heaven remembers. You smile. She found the lost one, Christ says, caught in a briar, bleeding a little, scared. You wait for the rescue, the joy. She carried it back, he continues. But when she returned, 5 more had gone. Your chest tightens. She hadn't realized the gate was unlatched. A breeze rustles the tall grass like a sigh woven into creation. She panicked, searched, found 2. One had fallen into a ditch. One had followed another shepherd's voice. And the others, you ask. They scattered. Christ turns to you, expression unreadable. She wept, he says, not because she failed, but because she thought she had done everything right. You feel that ache of giving your all, and still watching things fall apart. She told herself she should have stayed. Christ continues. But the truth is, there was no perfect choice. No way to be in two places. The parable shifts in your chest like a stone becoming a feather. What happened to the scattered ones, you whisper? They found their way back, Christ says. Not through her, through grace. She had to trust what she could not see. He kneels in the grass and runs his fingers through the earth. That's the part no one tells. That even good shepherds miss things. That even faithful ones misjudge. Some believe this untold parable is about spiritual leaders, how they carry the impossible tension of tending many while chasing one. Others think it's about parenting, friendship, even how we try to protect our own hearts. You look down at the crook in your hands. It's heavier now, but it's yours. She came back again and again, Christ says, never stopped trying, never blamed the sheep, only forgave herself slowly over time. You ask, was she remembered? His voice softens. Always. She's the reason the gate in heaven never swings shut. You let that settle deep inside you. 'Cause maybe you've been that shepherd, or maybe you've been the sheep. Either way, you're not forgotten. And as you walk on, a house begins to rise in the distance. Not made of stone or wood, but stories layered upon each other like breath and ink. It stands tall, but something is odd. Its windows are covered. Its doors under the house. What is that, you ask? Christ smiles, the kingdom under the bed. You laugh. That sounds like a bedtime story gone wrong. He winks, or gone deeper. He leads you down beneath the house. There's no staircase, just surrender. You descend through thought, memory, and old fears. And at the bottom, a door, small, child-sized. He gestures, open it. You kneel and push. It creaks not from rust, but reluctance. Inside treasures, not gold, not scrolls, not crowns. Shoeboxes, notes, sketches, broken jewelry, a sock. All the things hidden in childhood, all the things you forgot you hid. Christ steps beside you. There once was a boy, he begins, who found heaven not in a cathedral but under his bed. You look up. He prayed there, he continues, not because he was taught, but because the world above was loud. The boy spoke to God through whispers, drawn shapes, and made-up songs. He asked questions that no one answered, Christ says. And so heaven did. You scan the room. A soft giggle echoes. And what did God say, you ask? Nothing, Christ replies. God listened. You blink. That's it. Sometimes listening is the holiest reply, he says. Some believe this is a commentary on hidden faith, how the greatest revelations happen in secret. Others see it as a defense of childlike spirituality, too often dismissed by scholars. Christ walks to a corner. He kneels and pulls out a single page. You glimpse your handwriting. He grins. You've been here before. And you remember. A night when you were small, curled up, asking heaven for something, anything. And silence came, but now you know that silence was listening. You exit the little door, your heart strangely steadied, and Christ leads you on again. He points upward this time, toward a dove circling in the distance. She speaks, he says, twice. You rise from the low wooden bed, your body feeling not rested but realigned, like something inside you has been retuned to a frequency you forgot was yours. Christ walks ahead again, calm, barefoot, like gravity obeys him only out of politeness. The grove gives way to a high hill, and from its crest you see no cities, no temples, no pillars of flame, only sky. Sky that goes on. Sky that listens. And then you see it, a dove, hovering, not flying, suspended in stillness like it's held aloft by purpose alone. It turns its head toward you, and though it does not speak in voice, you feel it, the knowing, the heaviness of memory. This is the one, Christ says, who spoke twice. You blink slowly, unsure if you're ready for that to make sense. Christ begins again. The first time a dove descended, it was at the Jordan. You nod. You've heard it before. The baptism, the voice from heaven. This is my beloved Son. But what you don't know, Christ says, is that the dove returned. You turn to him when, in the wilderness. He begins the parable. After the water, after the voice, after the affirmation, came silence. And hunger, and the desert. You picture it, stones and sun and emptiness. And in that loneliness, Christ says, a dove returned. Not descending from heaven, but rising from the dust. You frown. A dove rising. He nods, because heaven isn't only above. Sometimes it answers from beneath. He continues. The dove came not with a declaration, but with a question. That catches you off guard. What was the question, you ask? He smiles. Do you still believe you are the beloved? Even here, a pause. You understand the weight of that. It's easy to believe you're loved when rivers open and voices boom from clouds. But in the wilderness, when your stomach growls and shadows stretch long, it's harder. The second voice of the dove, Christ says, is not for crowds. It's for deserts. You step forward slowly. The dove doesn't flee. Its eyes meet yours, and you feel exposed but not ashamed. Some say Christ continues that this second visitation never happened. He shrugs lightly. Maybe it didn't, maybe it did. But I know what it is to be asked not whether you believe in God, but whether you believe he still delights in you when no one is watching. You breathe slowly. Some interpret this story as a reflection of spiritual maturity, that the true test of identity comes not from affirmation, but from absence. Others think it's a parable about spiritual dryness, when heaven feels far, but isn't. You watch the dove rise slightly, wings never flapping, and then you hear it. Not words, but knowing. You are still mine. It's not loud, but it doesn't need to be. You kneel not out of reverence, but response. Like the only thing your soul can do right now is lower itself, soften, listen. Christ kneels beside you, not as Lord, just as a man who once walked through 40 days of silence and chose not to turn stones into comfort. You whisper, was that the harder choice? He nods, eyes closed. Every time. You ask why a dove again? He answers, because doves carry peace, but also questions, and most never notice the second one. The dove finally turns and flies off, not upward, but across the horizon, and with it a wind rises. Time to meet someone else, Christ says, rising slowly. Who, you ask? He smiles, a child. You squint. A very loud child, you ask, half joking. No, he says with a grin, a very wise one. You follow him down a winding trail lined with olive branches and childlike laughter, though no children are in sight. Eventually you arrive at a small courtyard. Dusty, sunlit, simple. A rabbi sits under a canopy of woven reeds reading from a scroll. Disciples crowd around, listening intently, and across from him on a low stool sits a child. Not fidgeting, not timid, listening. And then she speaks. The kingdom of God, she says, is smaller than the space between breaths. The rabbi looks up startled. Christ nods toward the scene. She was the teacher. You watch the parable unfold. There was once a rabbi, he begins, who sought the smallest commandment. He searched every scroll, asked every elder, measured every law. And then one day, Christ continues, he sat beside a child who was tracing dust with her fingers. You glance down, the dust again. She said nothing at first, just drew circles, then spirals, then lines that touched, but never crossed. He watched her for an hour, Christ says, then asked, what are you doing? She said, making space where God can sit down. You laugh softly, that's a good line. Christ raises an eyebrow. She meant it literally. You blink. What? She believed that when someone listens purely without agenda, heaven leans closer, and so she drew silence. The rabbi forgot his question. He began watching her lines. Eventually, he stopped teaching altogether, not because he lost faith, but because he started learning again. Some think this parable points to Christ's own conversations with children, how he raised their value in a world that dismissed them. Others say it's a story about spiritual humility, that wisdom often hides in low voices and small hands. You look around the courtyard. There are no adults left, only the child and you and Christ. And in the dust between you, another spiral appears. You didn't draw it. She did. The child smiles. And you feel something shift again. Not big, just enough. Christ stands, ready for the next. You nod. What is it? He answers, it starts in a grave and ends in linen. The child remains behind, tracing another spiral in the dust as you follow Christ into a narrowing path. The air cools, like walking into the hollow of a memory. The terrain darkens, not ominously, but with reverence, as if even heaven holds its breath near what you're about to see. Ahead lies a tomb, not grand, not hewn in white marble, but plain, ordinary. A round stone rests nearby, already rolled away. It's open not to invite fear, but to whisper that what once held death doesn't anymore. You glance at Christ. He's not somber, not glowing, just present. This is Lazarus's tomb, he says. You already know the story, the weeping sisters, the delay, the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. Then the cry, Lazarus, come forth, and the man wrapped in linen stumbling into the sunlight. But that's where most stop. Christ walks into the tomb, and so do you. Inside, the space feels strangely warm. No smell, no rot, just memory thick as incense. There was something else buried here, Christ says softly. You glance around. He reaches into a hollow in the wall and pulls out a folded cloth. Not the burial linen, smaller, tucked, hidden. What is it, you whisper? He opens it slowly. Words. Written not in ink, but in dust. You read them, you recognize your own name. How? He cuts you off gently, because you were part of this. And then he tells the parable. There was once a man who was called back from the dead, he begins. But when he emerged, he was not whole. You pause. But I thought, he lived again, Christ says. But he carried the in-between with him. What does that mean? The space between breath and no breath, between stillness and waking. You listen closely. Lazarus saw something, he continues, and it never left him, but he was told not to speak of it. By who? Christ smiles gently. By me. You feel a ripple in your chest. Not because it was unholy, he explains, but because it wasn't finished. You glance at the cloth again. The dust lettering shifts, becoming symbols, then blank again. What did he see? Christ sits on a stone bench. He saw a garden. You expect more. But he says nothing. And you understand that's all he was allowed to tell you. Some believe Lazarus glimpsed Eden not as it was, but as it will be. Others say he saw the Father, and the seeing was so overwhelming it rendered earthly speech insufficient. He carried it quietly, Christ says. People asked, but he'd just smile and touch his chest. You think of your own quiet knowings, the dreams you never shared, the feelings you couldn't explain. He wasn't resurrected to reveal, Christ continues. He was resurrected to live differently. You ask, and the linen? A message, he says, one I hid in the folds of grief. You touch the cloth again. This time the words read, you are still between. You frown. Christ explains this life. What you call life, it's the hallway. The dream between dreams. Then death is... He shrugs. Not the end, just another door. You remember the door that opened backward. You remember the vineyard, the coin, the dove, and now a man who saw something holy and was told not yet. Some truths, Christ says, ripen slowly. If Lazarus had spoken, people would have turned his vision into doctrine, fences, rules. But it was meant to be a seed. You step back and look around the tomb again. It feels less like a grave now, more like a womb, a place where something began, and maybe still is. Christ folds the cloth again, gently, reverently, and places it back into the hollow in the wall. He never took it with him, he says. He knew it wasn't his to keep. You nod even as you don't fully understand. Do you think, you ask quietly, that I've seen things too? Christ tilts his head. You wouldn't be here if you hadn't. A beat. And then he grins. But you're not done seeing. He rises, stretches his arms like a man who's carried too many stories. Let's go. You follow him out of the tomb and into the light. Not sunlight, not moonlight. Something brighter but softer. At the edge of the grove, a man waits. Strange. Wrapped in traveler's robes, dusty sandals, a satchel over one shoulder. Who's that, you ask? Christ smiles. A stranger, watching something that wasn't his to see, or so he thought. And just like that, you're stepping into Gethsemane, but not as you remember it, and certainly not alone. Gethsemane stretches before you, not as a place of dread, but of depth. The trees are older than memory, their twisted trunks like frozen prayers reaching toward a silent heaven. The leaves whisper not with wind, but with the echo of what happened here, what almost broke. You step softly behind Christ. His pace slows. His face changes. Not sorrowful, not radiant, just honest. This is where I chose to stay, he says. You nod. You know the story, the anguish, the sweat like blood, the sleeping disciples, the silence of God. But tonight he shows you someone else. The stranger, sitting just beyond the olive trees. Alone, watching. You study him, dark eyes, plain robe, calloused hands, not hiding, but not invited either. Who is he, you whisper? Christ replies, someone who saw me that night but never said a word. Not to me, not to anyone. You wait for the parable. He begins. There was once a man, nameless, faceless in scripture, who lived near the garden. He heard the footsteps, the murmured prayers, the silence that cracked the sky. He couldn't look away. He'd followed the teacher before Christ explains from a distance. Curious, skeptical, never close, always watching from the fringe. That night, something pulled him to Gethsemane. But he stayed in the shadows, afraid of being seen. Or maybe, afraid of belonging. You feel that. Belonging costs something. He saw me fall to my knees, Christ says. He saw me ask for the cup to pass. And he wept not because he understood, but because he didn't. The stranger watched salvation begin and didn't know what he was seeing. But he stayed. All night, Christ says. He watched. When the disciples slept, he didn't. When I returned to find them still resting, his eyes were open. Why didn't you call him over, you ask? Christ smiles softly. Because some invitations aren't spoken, they're felt. You turn back to the man. He hasn't moved. He wasn't there to intervene, Christ continues. He was there to witness. Heaven always plants one. One what? Someone outside the story, whose only role is to remember. You exhale. Some believe this parable points to unrecorded witnesses of sacred moments, the unknown faithful. Others say it's a reflection of you, the modern listener awake at night, watching holiness unfold in a story not meant to center them, but to move them. He never told anyone what he saw, Christ says. You ask why not? Because he wasn't sure it had happened, he replies. It felt too intimate, too impossible, like a dream heaven had left in his heart. You walk a little closer. The stranger turns just a little, and now you see it. His face is yours. Not exactly, but enough. Enough to know the story is closer than it seemed. You were there, Christ whispers. You blink, meet, in a way, and suddenly you understand. Every time you've sat in silence, unsure of your part, every time you've watched someone else's pain and longed to help, but didn't know how, every time you felt near to the sacred yet uninvited, you were Gethsemane's stranger, not absent, just unscripted. He left before the soldiers came, Christ says, but not out of fear. He just knew it wasn't his moment. You ask, was he changed? Christ nods. He never taught, never preached, never wrote a word, but he raised a daughter who became a listener, and she raised a son who became a healer, and the story continued. You breathe it in. Not all faith is loud. Some of it watches and waits. You look around Gethsemane. It doesn't ache anymore. It hums. Not with suffering, with presence. As you step away from the garden, you feel something inside you settle like a bell that has stopped ringing but still vibrates. Christ walks beside you again. There's one more thing here, he says. You follow his gaze to a large stone courtyard empty. A feast has been prepared, but there is no table, no cups, no plates, only silence. What is this, you ask? He answers, the silent banquet. You step into the space, unsure if you're allowed. You are. He begins the parable. There was once a king who prepared a banquet, but only for the uninvited. You glance around. How did they know to come? They didn't, he says. They were led here, in dreams, in silence, in hunger they couldn't name. You ask, what did they eat? He smiles. Nothing you could see, nothing they could taste, but they left filled. The guests arrived quietly. They sat, they listened. No one spoke. Not because they were forbidden, because the silence was enough. Some wept, some smiled. Some closed their eyes and saw people they missed. Some forgave themselves. And then they left, changed. You walk through the invisible table, and you feel it. The invitation you never received because it was always waiting inside you. Not all meals feed the body. Some feed the places you didn't know were starving. Christ places a hand on your back. This is how heaven feasts, he says. Not always with bread, sometimes with breath. You turn toward him. Will I come back here? He grins. You already have. And the olive trees whisper again, not with history, but with hope. And somewhere overhead, the sky is stirring. The next parable swims below. The trees thin as you walk, and the air grows cooler, not cold, but deep, like standing near a lake at dusk. Christ leads you to the edge of a cliff. Below, the sea lies motionless. Then you notice something moving just beneath the surface. A single fish, then another. Then dozens, swirling like brushstrokes in a painting only God could finish. Christ sits on a stone and gestures for you to do the same. He looks out over the water and begins. There was once a fisherman, he says, who cast his net for many years, not for profit, for joy. You imagine him barefoot, sun-soaked eyes weathered by both storm and sunrise. But one day, Christ continues, he saw a fish so beautiful he dropped his net. You raise an eyebrow? He dove in after it, Christ says, but the fish swam away. Not fast, not fearful, just deliberate. The man followed, Christ says, every morning, every evening. He stopped casting nets, stopped fishing altogether. You ask, did he ever catch it? Christ shakes his head. It refused. You glance out at the sea again. The fish are still circling, too far to touch, but close enough to feel real. What kind of fish was it, you ask? Christ smiles, the kind that knows it's been called, but isn't ready. You blink slowly. You know that feeling. The fish, he says, wasn't rebellious. It was listening to something older than the net. And the fisherman, you ask. He waited, Christ replies. He waited. He prayed. He stopped needing the fish and started loving the water. You look again at the surface. One fish lingers a moment longer than the rest. You swear it looks back at you. Then it disappears. Some believe this parable is about callings we resist. Others say it's about people, those who feel drawn to something divine, yet run from it because it feels too big, too bright, too much. You turn to Christ. Why didn't you just catch the fish? He laughs gently, because love waits, even when nets are strong. The wind picks up slightly, not enough to chill, just enough to remind you that something sacred is moving. You remember other times you swam the other way, not because you were angry, but because you were scared, or tired, or unsure of your name. Christ looks at you. You were never swimming alone. You feel that. And the sea still calls. But so does the shore. Christ stands brushing dust from his hands. There's more, he says. More fish, you ask? He smiles. No, something stranger. You follow him along a narrow ridge that winds behind a hillside covered in vines that twist like questions. The air thickens slightly, as if time is folding in. And then you feel it. Backwards. Not dizzy, not wrong, just reversed. Birds fly left to right, but their wings flap the opposite way. Trees seem to grow downward. Footprints rise from the ground instead of sinking in. Christ stops and grins. Welcome to the kingdom in reverse. You stare. This feels less like a place and more like a parable that's somehow become real. He begins the story without warning. There was once a man who entered the kingdom and realized that up was down, first was last, rich was poor, and all the doors opened from the inside. He walks as he speaks, and the path literally bends behind him like it's being unmade as he steps forward. He was confused, Christ says. Every time he tried to rise, he sank. Every time he gave something away, he gained more. When he tried to lead, no one followed. When he served, crowds gathered. You laugh. Sounds like a paradox. Christ nods. It is, and it's also the truth. You walk upside up through a landscape that seems built on paradoxes. The man finally stopped trying, Christ says. And when he did, the kingdom unfolded like a scroll. What did he see? Everything Christ whispers, but backwards. He saw the beginning from the end. He saw creation as a return, not a launch. He saw salvation not as escape, but embrace. And most of all, he saw himself not as a hero, but as a healed wound. You stand in a field of reversed echoes. Laughter falls upward. Music plays in silence. Some believe this parable is about the Beatitudes, those teachings that invert power. Blessed are the meek, the poor, the persecuted. Others say it reflects the way heaven operates on entirely different logic, where losing is winning and surrender is strength. You ask, is this how it really works? Christ tilts his head. Define really. You smile. Because, it feels realer than the world that rewards pride and speed. Here, everything flows in the direction of grace. You stand in the middle of this reversed kingdom and realize it's not backwards. It's restored. The way things were always meant to be. The way you were meant to be. Christ takes your hand. One more parable waits. A crown. But this one has no thorns. You emerge from the kingdom in reverse, feeling taller, though no height has changed. The world feels lighter, though nothing has been lifted. There's a clarity to your breath, like exhaling things you didn't know you'd held for years. Christ walks beside you again, and in the quiet, you notice something resting in his hand. It's not glowing. It's not adorned. It's simple. A crown, but unlike any you've seen. No gold. No gems. And most curiously, no thorns. He notices your gaze. This one's rarely spoken of, he says. It was never worn in Jerusalem. It was never mocked. It was never bloody. You ask, then where did it come from? He smiles faintly, from before. You walk with him into a garden, not Eden, not Gethsemane, but something in between. It's wild, untrimmed, beautiful in its chaos. Sunlight filters through leaves that never learn to obey gravity. Birds rest on branches that seem to hum. And there in the center is a low stone altar. Christ places the crown gently on top. This, he says, is the thornless crown. He begins the parable. There was once a boy who dreamed of being a king, not for power, but for peace. Already you feel the shift. This story carries no warning, just wonder. He never fought, never shouted, never demanded. But one day, Christ continues, he was given a crown. Not of metal, but of woven light. It rested on his head without weight. And wherever he walked, people felt calm. Even his enemies. Especially them. You furrow your brow. Why haven't I heard this story? Because it wasn't dramatic, Christ answers. It didn't involve conquest or sacrifice. It didn't make for gripping sermons. Was it real, you ask? He smiles, real enough to reach you. The boy's rule was quiet. He led by listening. He answered questions with questions. And when people came to crown him with thorns because surely pain was the price of leadership, he gently refused. Not out of fear, Christ says, but because he knew suffering wasn't the only proof of love. That sentence settles in you like fresh air after rain. Some believe this parable reflects a vision Christ had in the wilderness, a possible path never chosen. Others say it represents what the kingdom of God could look like if gentleness were allowed to lead. You glance at the crown again. It doesn't shimmer, but it seems to pulse slightly like it's breathing. What happened to the boy, you ask? He disappeared, Christ says, not in death, but into the hearts of those he calmed. You whisper, is that why I feel him now? Christ only nods. You step closer to the altar. For a moment you want to touch it, maybe even wear it. But something stops you. Not fear. Respect. This crown doesn't command, it waits. Christ speaks again. Most associate kingship with wounds. You think of thrones of blood, of shouting crowds. But real authority, he says, comes from the absence of needing it. He sits beside the altar, legs crossed like a child beneath a tree. You sit too. The garden hums around you. Bees float through flowers that seem to nod when passed. A breeze carries the scent of something ancient, cedar and fresh bread, and the laughter of someone you loved once but can't name. You could have worn this, you say. I did, he replies, before the thorns, and I will again. You let that truth settle. This is not a replacement. It's a restoration. And suddenly you understand something. The crown of thorns was not the end of the story. It was the interruption. This is the true beginning. You turn to him. Does this garden have a name? He grins. It's called mercy before memory. You raise an eyebrow. That sounds backwards. He laughs. It's what the kingdom in reverse taught you, isn't it? You nod slowly. You glance back at the altar. The crown is gone. You don't ask where it went. You know. It's been placed in you. Not to rule, but to remember how to rest. Christ stands again. There's a tree nearby, he says, older than Eden. You follow? A new story waits. A tree that remembers something you never saw, but always felt. The garden falls away behind you, though you don't recall turning. It's as if this path forms only as you're ready for it, as though each parable reveals itself like a ripple waiting for your foot to step. The air thickens not with weight, but with memory, not yours alone. You feel as if you're walking into a dream remembered by God himself. Christ gestures forward, and there it is. A tree. It stands at the center of a quiet field alone, but not lonely. Its trunk is wide enough to hold generations. Its bark is etched with strange lines, half natural, half purposeful, like time left fingerprints on it. You take a few slow steps toward it. The leaves are wide, dark, and veined with gold. They shimmer without light. And though there's no fruit hanging, the tree seems full, like it's still digesting something it's not ready to give back. Christ walks ahead and sits under it. He pats the grass beside him. You sit. He looks up as if greeting an old friend. This is the tree that remembered Eden, he says quietly. You tilt your head, not the tree of Eden. He smiles. No, that one was forbidden. This one was forgotten. And he begins the parable. There was once a tree, he says, that stood at the edge of Eden, not near the center where the other two were placed, not famous, not guarded by flaming swords. A third tree, you ask? He nods. A witness. One who never bore fruit. One who was never tasted. You wait. When the humans left Eden, Christ continues this tree was not removed. It stayed behind. And it watched. Watched what? The unraveling. You picture it wind carrying away innocent soil, closing over abandoned footprints. The tree kept growing, he says, not taller, wider, with every memory it received. You ask, received from where? From heaven, Christ says. From earth. From angels passing overhead. From the animals that never spoke again. From the river that dried when the ground stopped being sacred. Your heart aches suddenly. It grew so full, he continues, that it could no longer bear fruit. Not because it was cursed, but because it chose to remember instead. Some believe this parable hints at something outside Genesis, a piece of the story not preserved in the canon, but echoing in apocryphal traditions. Others say the tree is a symbol for collective memory, for divine grief. But Christ says nothing of symbols. He places his palm on the trunk, and the tree glows slightly like a breath inhaled after centuries. And then something strange happens. The bark opens, not violently, not like splitting, like yielding, and inside is fruit. Not apple, not fig, something different, translucent. You can see light inside it, moving. What is it, you whisper? Christ answers, memory made edible. You hesitate. Am I supposed to? He shakes his head gently. Not yet. You don't need to eat it. You need to rest near it. So you do. You lean back against the tree and it feels alive. Its bark adjusts to your spine like it remembers your shape. And then the memories come. But not in visions. In feelings. You feel the warmth of a world before shame. You feel the laughter of creatures who never needed names. You feel the music of a place where time had no teeth. And most of all, you feel seen. Christ leans his head back beside you. This tree, he says, holds no judgment, only memory. It doesn't tell you who you should be. It helps you remember who you were before forgetting. You nod slowly. A leaf falls. Not from age, from grace. You catch it in your lap. Written across its veins, barely visible, are words that shift like shadows in sunlight. You were not cast out, you wandered. Your breath catches. All these years thinking exile was punishment. And now, some believe this story explains why some people feel deep longing they can't name, a homesickness for something they've never seen. Others think it reflects the soul's pre-temporal memory, that longing for a garden we once knew. You feel the leaf curl slightly in your hand. Not dying, sleeping. Christ rises, it's time. For what you ask. To speak without words. You follow him away from the tree. Not with reluctance, but reverence. It remains behind you, humming gently its roots, holding your footprints with care. You enter a wide clearing, no sound, no breeze, just space. Christ stops in the center. This, he says, is where I once taught without speaking. You frown. To who? He grins. To a crowd, to a mountain, to the sky. You wait. He lifts one hand and doesn't say a thing. But the air changes, and the next parable begins without a single word. You stand in the center of silence. It's not uncomfortable. It's complete. Like being wrapped in a thought so old words can no longer carry it. Christ stands just ahead, one hand raised, not commanding, just offering. You look around. There is no crowd. And yet, you feel watched. Not judged, witnessed. The trees lean in, the air listens. Even the light seems to pause in midair, as if waiting to see what you will do with this moment. Christ lowers his hand and smiles. That, he says softly, was a full teaching. You open your mouth to ask how, but the question melts. Because, you felt it. Then he begins the parable, this time with words. There was once a teacher, he says, who walked to a hilltop with no scrolls, no disciples, no intention. You follow his steps in your mind. He arrived to find people already waiting. Not because they knew he was coming, but because they had questions and no one else would listen. He sat down. He did not speak. They waited, Christ says. Minutes, hours, some left. But others stayed, not for teaching, but for presence. Eventually, the teacher began to move, not with words, but gestures. He drew a circle. He raised both hands. He touched the earth. He looked to the sky, and somehow, each person understood something unique. One woman remembered a promise, Christ says. One man forgave his brother. One child saw angels. One skeptic stayed silent for the first time in years. You stare. How could that be? Because sometimes Christ says the soul doesn't need syllables. It needs stillness. He steps closer. The teacher never explained himself, he continues. And when people returned the next day, he was gone. No signs. No sermons. Just a memory that refused to fade. Some believe this is a secret telling of a day between miracles lost to history but remembered in heaven. Others think it reflects how Christ often answered questions with silence, and how presence in its purest form teaches. You glance around again. There are no seats here, no pulpit, no altar, and yet something sacred clings to the space. You felt it, Christ says, even now. You nod. He chuckles lightly. I once spoke more in silence than I ever did in words. And somehow you believe him. He takes a breath. Ready to move on. You nod. What's next? He tilts his head slightly. A gatekeeper. You frown, like Peter. He grins. No, older. He leads you down a slope into what looks like a forest. But the trees are strange. They have no bark. They shimmer. Their trunks seem to phase in and out, like they're unsure which world they belong to. In the middle of this forest is a gate. Not grand, not guarded. Just waiting. A small figure stands beside it. Not angelic in the classic sense. No wings, no flaming sword, just robes and quiet eyes. Their hair is braided with small glowing strands, almost like starlight woven into memory. Christ nods toward them. This, he says, is heaven's forgotten gatekeeper. You step closer. The figure doesn't look at you, but they notice you. And then Christ begins the story. There was once a gate, he says, that stood between worlds, not heaven and earth, but between what is remembered and what is real. You're not sure you understand, that's okay. The one assigned to it, Christ continues, was quiet. They didn't test. They didn't judge. They only noticed. Who walked in? Who walked out? Who lingered on the threshold? For centuries, he says, they let things pass both ways. Thoughts, dreams, even tears. But one day something changed. A soul arrived too early. You blink, too early. Christ nods, not by accident, but by ache, a longing so strong it broke timing. The gatekeeper hesitated. They had been told not to interfere, Christ says, but this one soul asked. Not with words, with yearning. And so the gatekeeper let it through, he says. You wait. And the soul returned, Christ says, changed. Not enlightened, not crowned, but carrying something strange. What was it? A voice it didn't have before, a peace it couldn't explain, a memory that hadn't yet happened. You exhale. Was it punished? No, he says, but the gatekeeper was forgotten. Forgotten. By heaven, no, by earth, yes. Their task remained, but their name didn't. They became rumor, folklore, a whisper in the space between dreams. Some believe this parable refers to intuition, that gate you feel open before something sacred is spoken. Others think it's about liminal space, the spiritual moments between sleep and waking pain, and healing time and eternity. You ask, are they still here? Christ gestures gently toward the figure. They nod at you, just once. And for a moment the air around you shifts. You feel a memory enter you, but not your own. It's a memory of being let through, not to escape, to glimpse. You blink, and the gatekeeper is gone, but the gate remains. And now, you realize something's on the other side of it. A storm. Not one you run from, one you enter. You face the gate alone now, at least in form. Christ is still near, but he's gone quiet. Not absent, just letting the moment speak. Letting the wind push gently around you as if guiding, not forcing. On the other side of the gate, clouds gather. But it's not thunder you fear, it's truth. You step through, and the world changes. The sky is cracked marble, streaked in gray, soft light pouring in through fractures like heaven is bleeding dawn. The air hums with an energy that isn't angry, but deeply, deeply awake. You turn to Christ, who has followed. He doesn't say anything, just points. And there, unfolding above the ocean like a breath too long held, a storm. Not metaphorical, not imagined. A real storm. Lightning that doesn't strike but dances. Waves that rise but never crash. And in the middle of it, silence. He begins the parable. There was once a storm, Christ says, that I did not calm. You stop, because that doesn't match the stories you know. The disciples were not in the boat this time, he says. No crowds, no miracles, just me. You look up again at the storm. It seems to bend around a center that cannot be seen. I walked into it alone, Christ continues. Not to test my strength, but to meet something older than fear. The wind picks up, but it doesn't press against you. It lifts you slightly as if reminding you how light your soul truly is. He continues, it was a night of no direction. I asked no questions. I expected no answer. I simply entered. You ask what happened. I was not harmed, he says. I was not comforted, I was held. The storm did not end, but it also did not swallow. It was the only time, he adds, that heaven asked me to trust without signs. You let that echo, because you know this storm. You've lived it. The season when the prayers go unanswered, the nights when peace doesn't come, the days when clarity is a distant shore you'll never reach. But you kept walking. Some believe this parable was a vision Christ received in the wilderness where not even angels intervened. Others say it's symbolic of the dark night of the soul, a trial that doesn't come to test, but to reorient. You ask, why tell me this now? Because he answers, you've walked through storms and thought you failed because they didn't break. You look again at the thunder above you. You thought peace meant escape, he adds. But sometimes peace means presence. The waves below rise like lungs inhaling. You ask, did the storm know you were there? Christ chuckles gently. It made room for me. You realize even chaos recognizes the presence of the one who created order. Even the storm made space. You turn in a slow circle. There is no escape route, no door out. And yet, you don't want to leave. Because for the first time, the storm doesn't scare you. It sees you, and then Christ points again. Far above, just out of reach, something glints. A coin. You squint. He smiles. It's lost. You frown. In the sky, and so begins the next parable. There was once a woman, he says, who lost a coin. Not in her house, not in her pocket, in the stars. You tilt your head. That seems unlikely. Christ grins. And yet, she looked everywhere, he continues. On earth, in dreams, in the eyes of strangers, in books and prophecies. She searched so well she forgot what she was missing. You ask, then how did she know she lost it? She felt it, he says. A weight missing, a brightness gone dim. Eventually she stopped searching. She sat down, looked up, and there it was, nestled in the sky, flickering behind a constellation only she could name. A coin lost in the sky, Christ repeats, too far to grasp, too close to ignore. You follow his gaze. There it is. Small, spinning, reflecting not the sun, but you. What is it, you whisper? He answers a part of your story you haven't remembered yet. You step closer. Why show me now? Because it's time. You reach upward, not with your hands, but with your heart. The coin doesn't fall, but it glows. And suddenly you feel it in your chest, a presence long missing. Not a thing, a knowing. Some believe this parable is about destiny, the kind hidden from even our own minds. Others say it's about grace always hovering just out of reach until we look up instead of forward. You look again. The coin is gone, but you're not. You're more. Christ walks again. You follow. The storm fades behind you, not ended, just integrated. A new light emerges on the horizon. Not sunrise, not fire, laughter, real, ancient. Coming from a place not ahead, but above. Christ turns. Want to hear the first laugh in heaven? You grin. You already are. The sound reaches you before the place does. Laughter. Not loud, not manic, but deep, round, and resonant, like it's been echoing through eternity, waiting for someone to finally hear it again. You look at Christ. He's smiling before you even ask. That he says softly is the first laugh in heaven. You pause, before angels, before time. He nods, before sorrow was even possible. You follow him along a gently rising hill, the grass here soft and shimmering with dew that never dries. The sky above brightens not into day, but into something beyond measurement. The air sparkles not with dust, but with delight. And at the top of the hill, you see them. Not people, not angels, not creatures, but shapes, essences. They move like joy with form. They bounce without touching the ground. They play without rules. They don't speak. They laugh. Christ sits in the grass and gestures for you to join him. This, he says, was the first sound made in the kingdom. You blink, not light. He shakes his head. That was the first act. But this was the first response. You look at the laughing beings. They're not remembering anything he adds. They're rejoicing in what simply is. You watch them twirl and shimmer, and something stirs in your chest. A chuckle not forced, not polite. It escapes before you can think. Christ nods. There it is. You laugh again. And suddenly it's not just a sound. It's a release. You feel a loosening in your ribs, in your throat, in your very name. Who were they, you ask, breathless? No one you'd know, Christ says. They didn't become saints. They didn't shape history. They were joy. That was enough. You try to study them, but they shift too quickly, always just past the edge of shape. Like color you can't name. There was once a woman, Christ begins, who lost everything. You feel the parable arrive like a warm wind. She lost her child, her home, her voice. You swallow. She came to heaven not with songs or prayers, but silence. You wait. But when she reached the gates, she heard laughter, and she wept. 'Cause it didn't offend her. It reminded her. She remembered laughter from before the pain, before the grief, before the story bent. You close your eyes. You've heard that laughter too. Faint, forgotten, but there. She joined them, Christ says. And now she laughs still. Some believe this parable is about heaven's true tone, not solemnity but delight. Others say it's about the holiness of joy, that laughter isn't less spiritual than reverence. It is reverence. You ask, is this joy always here? Christ nods. Even when you don't feel it. Even when you're breaking. Especially then. You ask, why don't we hear it on earth? He looks at you quiet. Then answers, because too many think God frowns more than he smiles. That lands hard. Because maybe you've been one of them. He continues. But every time a child laughs, every time someone forgives, and then giggles from relief, every time grief gives way to sudden stupid joy, the sound returns. You look up again. One of the beings just for a moment seems to mimic your shape. It nods. You laugh once more. It echoes. Not outward, inward. Into every cracked place. Into every silent ache. You ask, will I laugh like this when I die? Christ smiles. You're already laughing now. The hill pulses with warmth. And then just like that it stills. The laughter doesn't end. It rests. Like it knows when enough has been said. Christ stands. You ready? You nod. He turns toward a narrow pathway carved into light. What's next, you ask? He grins. A parable that changed, even while I was telling it. You pause. That's allowed? Oh yes, he says, especially when the listener is changing too. The path narrows now, not from constraint, but precision, like it was carved for your feet before you were ever born. The grass here is shorter, the light cooler. It feels like entering the hushed breath between words. A pause. Before revelation. You follow Christ through the quiet. His pace is steady, unhurried, like he's not just taking you somewhere but waiting for you to arrive. Then you see it. A circle of stones, a gathering place, not ancient, timeless. And at its center, a scroll, rolled tightly tied with red thread resting atop a small pedestal made of unpolished wood. Christ gestures toward it. This, he says, is the parable that changed mid-sentence. You pause. How can that happen? He grins, because sometimes the soul listening is more alive than the words being spoken. He kneels beside the scroll and begins to unwrap it. There was once a young man, he says, who sought purpose. He asked a teacher, "Tell me the story that will define my life." You nod. A familiar setup. The teacher began. Christ continues speaking of a traveler on a road, of storms and choices and distant fires. But as the young man listened, something shifted. What you ask? The teacher noticed the man's eyes had stopped searching, he says. They had started remembering. He pauses and looks up at you. You see the story the teacher was telling. Wasn't the one the man needed. You step closer to the scroll. Its surface ripples like parchment made of water. Christ goes on, so the teacher let the story change. Mid-word, mid-breath, mid-truth. And just like that, the parable transformed. No longer a traveler, now a gardener. No longer seeking, now cultivating. The young man's story had always been one of return, Christ says. Not of journey, but he didn't know that until he listened long enough to see himself. You blink, because you've been that traveler, and that gardener, and maybe something else entirely. Some believe this parable is about the living word that spiritual truth adapts to the condition of the heart in real time. Others say it reflects how Christ taught in layers, allowing the same story to meet different people differently. You ask, but didn't that confuse people? Christ nods, only the ones who needed answers more than transformation. The scroll glows faintly now. You look down at it. The words aren't just letters, they're mirrors. Each line reflects a different version of you. The one who doubted, the one who hoped, the one who wept behind closed doors, the one who dreamed before the world told you to be smaller. And in the center, no words at all, just space for what you ask. For you, Christ says, you sit across from him. The stones around you seem to warm in response, like they're listening. There was another time I changed a parable, he says almost sheepishly, right in the middle. You smile. Let me guess, someone interrupted. He laughs. Worse, I interrupted myself. You raise an eyebrow. I started to say, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking fine pearls. You nod. I remember that one. But before I could finish, he says, I saw a woman in the crowd. Her hands were shaking. She had come only to listen, not to be seen. You lean in. She had sold everything for one small coin, Christ says, not to buy a pearl, to survive. She was the parable. And so he adds, I changed it, mid-sentence. I said, who, when he found one pearl of great value, went and sold all he had and bought it. You whisper, but that wasn't the original ending, was it? He shakes his head. It wasn't even an ending, it was an invitation. You sit back in the grass, and suddenly you understand, sometimes heaven doesn't finish the story. It hands you the pen. You look again at the scroll. The red thread lies beside it, loosened. Christ places a hand over it. You don't need to write anything, he says. You're already living it. Somewhere nearby, a breeze picks up. It flips the edge of the scroll, but there are no more pages. Just light and silence. And you stand slowly. What now? Christ rises too. Now we walk toward the fire. You pause. Fire? He nods, but this one leaves no ashes. The path ahead curves gently upward like the breath before a word. The grass begins to thin. Stones replace soil soft and warm underfoot. And in the distance, flickering light dances across the horizon, not harsh, not consuming, gentle, alive. Christ walks beside you again, quiet for a while, like he's letting the stillness between stories linger a moment longer. Then he says, most fires destroy? You nod, but not this one. You crest a low ridge, and there it is. A flame, singular, suspended just above the ground. It doesn't flicker in wind, there is no wind. It doesn't consume what it touches, there is nothing to burn. It simply is. Soft, bright, pure. This, Christ says, is the fire that left no ashes. You both sit at a respectful distance, not from fear, but reverence. And then he begins the parable. There was once a man, he says, who carried too many memories. You listen. The fire pulses in rhythm with the story. Not sins, not failures, memories, beautiful ones, painful ones. He carried them like sacred stones in a sack over his shoulder. You feel the weight just hearing it. He thought he was honoring them by keeping them close, Christ says. But they had started to crush him. One day the man wandered into a clearing and saw a flame just like this one. No smoke, no heat, just light. He approached, Christ continues, and the flame spoke not in words but in recognition. The flame knew what he carried. He fell to his knees, Christ says, and the flame offered no promise, no threat, just invitation. You whisper, what did it ask? To let the sack touch the edge. Not to throw it in, not to burn it. Just let it touch. The man hesitated. These memories were his story, his identity, his proof. But eventually Christ says he lowered the sack. And the flame reached out without moving, just being. And the sack did not burn. It opened, and the stones turned to light. You look up at the fire before you. It flickers once softly. Some believe this parable is about release not from guilt, but from attachment. Others say it's a reflection of divine purification that doesn't destroy, but transforms. You ask, why no ashes? Christ replies, because nothing was lost, only returned. Returned to what? To me, he says. You glance down at your own chest and for a moment you feel it. The weight you've carried. Not shame, but old precious burdens. The smile you remember from someone long gone. The heartbreak you still honor. The dream you gave up but still visit in sleep. They're not meant to be carried forever, he says. Only long enough to understand them. You ask, can I? He nods. You reach into your spirit and somehow your hands emerge holding something you didn't realize was so heavy. A memory, a hope, a silence you never forgave. You hold it near the fire, and it does not burn. It unfolds, and becomes a beam of golden light, rising slowly upward like incense returning to its origin. You exhale, deeply. Tears come not from grief, from release. The flame pulses once more, then quiets. You and Christ sit in silence for a while, watching the fire that consumes nothing but still changes everything. Eventually, he speaks again. There's something I once longed for, he says quietly. You turn? He looks young, old, infinite, tender. I never told anyone, he says, because even the Son of God can carry longing. You ask, what did you long for? He doesn't answer. He just stands and walks toward a hill you hadn't noticed until now, a place where dreams live, or die, or both. Come, he says, and you do, because whatever this next parable is, you already feel it beating in your chest. The hill rises gently, not with majesty, but with memory. Its grass is darker, the soil richer. You feel it as you climb. This place has held sorrow and hope. It carries a quiet gravity like the ground itself has heard confessions no mouth dared speak aloud. Christ walks slowly now and you notice the shift in him. Less storyteller, more dreamer. You reach the summit. There's no throne here, no altar, just a patch of earth that looks unfinished. Christ stands at its edge staring down. And then he says softly, this is where I buried the dream that never came true. You stay quiet, it feels right. He kneels touching the earth with 2 fingers like a prayer passed through skin and stone. I once dreamed, he says, that love alone would be enough. He doesn't look at you as he speaks. I dreamed that kindness would be contagious, that mercy would catch like fire, that once people tasted grace, they would never hunger for cruelty again. He lets that sit in the air. I dreamed, he continues, that I could heal them without being hurt, that I could save them without being rejected. You feel a weight move through the wind. And I knew, he adds, it wouldn't be that way. But I hoped, he whispers, for just one generation, one city, even one friend who would understand without having to lose me first. You breathe, but carefully, because this is sacred ground. And when it didn't happen, Christ says, I buried the dream, not in anger, not in bitterness, but like a seed. Some believe this parable is about Christ's humanity, the part that felt hoped, desired. Others say it's about us, the aching gap between divine intention and human resistance. You kneel beside him. He finally turns to you. I'm not telling you this to make you sad, he says. I'm telling you because you've buried dreams too. You nod, silently. Dreams of reconciliation, of being seen, of not needing to explain your pain all the time. They weren't wasted, he says. They weren't failures. You look down at the soil, and something glimmers. Tiny. A root, a thread. A promise. They've just gone underground, Christ says. He stands, and gestures for you to do the same. Come, he says. We're almost there. You descend the hill in silence, and something inside you is rising. You don't know what, but it feels patient and powerful. At the base of the hill, the light changes. It's dusk now, and the sky above flickers. Stars? No. Letters. A story still being written. And then Christ says, It's time to tell you the final one. You brace yourself. But he just smiles. It's the one you're living. You pause. He steps aside and points not to a tree or a gate or a scroll, but to you, and begins. There was once a person, he says, who heard a story they weren't supposed to remember, but they did. You inhale. There was once a heart, he continues, so full of ache and wonder that heaven leaned in to listen. You close your eyes, and you hear it. The coin, the dove, the fire, the laugh. All of it circling now not around Christ, but around you. The parable, he says, is not something I told. It's something you became. Some believe this final parable is about the listener, that sacred role too often forgotten. Others say it's about transformation, how encountering the divine doesn't end in comprehension, but embodiment. You whisper, and now Christ steps forward, takes your hand, and says only, "Now we walk it together." You don't move at first. The words hang there, not as sound, but shape. Now we walk it together. Christ doesn't rush you, he waits, as if the decision to walk your own story, to live the parable, requires more courage than hearing it ever did. Eventually, your feet remember. You take a step, then another. The world doesn't change around you. You change in it. The hills remain. The stars still shimmer. But now the path feels like it was carved in your image, not just his. As you walk beside him, Christ is quiet again. But this silence isn't absence, it's presence so thick it fills the air like honey. You realize he's giving you space to feel what's rising, not instruction, not doctrine, just realization. You pass a grove of trees with silver bark, each trunk split into two, as if mirroring itself. In their center, you see something resting beneath their shade. A crown, not of gold, not of thorns. Thornless like the one you saw before, but this one is different. It's not for kingship. It's for completion. Christ watches you notice it. He doesn't say anything. But you know this crown isn't yours to wear yet. He continues walking, and you follow. The path winds until you reach a clearing with one single tree in its center. Its leaves shimmer in three tones: memory, mercy, and mystery. At its base, a low well. You step toward it. There's water inside, but you don't see your reflection. You see a moment, one you haven't lived yet. A future kindness, a future forgiveness, a future courage. You turn to Christ, and he speaks again. There was once a traveler, he says, who reached the end of a long road and found a single fruit waiting on a table with a note. Eat only if you remember what this cost. You wait. The traveler wept, he says, not from guilt, from gratitude. They didn't eat the fruit that day. They picked it up, placed it in their pocket, and walked the long road back. You whisper, why? Christ smiles, because someone else might need it more. Some believe this parable is about the selfless nature of redemption, that true transformation doesn't cling to gifts, it carries them onward. Others say it's about the path of return, that walking back with wisdom is as holy as pressing forward with zeal. Christ sits beside the well. The tree rustles above him with no breeze. You kneel and dip your hand into the water. It's cool, electric, eternal, but still simple, like spring water made of old tears. You sip it, and suddenly the path behind you plays like music. Every step, every stumble, every pause, it all belonged. You feel the ache that once made no sense finally hum with harmony. Christ rises again. There's one more place to see, but he pauses and turns to you with eyes softer than time. There's something I've wanted to show you since the beginning, he says. You follow him through a narrow veil of light so thin it looks like a breath. And then you emerge into a grove where trees grow upside down. Roots stretch toward the stars. Leaves drink starlight from below. It feels completely backward, and yet utterly right. He walks to the base of one tree and brushes soil from a carved word. Your name, written not on bark, but on root. You kneel beside him. He begins the parable without voice. Instead, he reaches into the soil, pulls out something small, a seed, then places it in your hand. You look up at him. He nods. You'll know when to plant it, he says. And then, without warning, the sky opens. But not with thunder, with remembrance. 100 parables you haven't heard yet rise like mist from the ground. And you realize you haven't finished your story. You've just reached the part where you begin telling it with your life. You hold the seed in your hand. It's small, smaller than any truth you've ever clung to. Smooth, warm, and strangely heavy, like it carries echoes of something that hasn't happened yet. Christ watches you. Not expectantly, lovingly. He doesn't say when you should plant it. He doesn't tell you what will grow. Because he knows if he told you, it wouldn't be faith. It would be instruction. And this part of your journey isn't about certainty. It's about wonder. He leads you out of the grove of upside-down trees where roots stretch toward light and leaves drink darkness like wine. And beyond it, something rises into view. A hill, a wide, gentle slope, and at the top a single tree. Familiar. You walk toward it slowly, heart thudding in a way that's not fear, but recognition. You've seen this tree before, not here. In scripture, in stories, in visions. It's the tree of life, but not as you imagined. It's not blinding, not jeweled, not perfect. It's scarred. Its bark bears marks of fire, of frost of hands, both reverent and reckless. Its roots are tangled with history. Its branches reach toward places not yet created. You and Christ sit beneath it, and he begins again. There was once a tree, he says, that was not planted but remembered. You look up. It did not grow in Eden, nor in heaven. It grew in the soul of someone who forgave when they had every reason not to. You breathe slowly. The first fruit didn't grow from soil, Christ continues. It grew from sorrow that chose not to become bitterness. You feel it in your chest. Because you know that kind of choice. The tree of life isn't a place, he says softly. It's a person becoming. Some believe this parable rewrites everything we expect, that the tree isn't waiting in a distant paradise, but inside those who carry mercy in defiance of despair. Others say it's Christ himself branching out through every act of love we never expected to do. You reach up, not to take, just to touch. The branch responds. It lowers slightly, brushing your fingers like a parent's hand on a sleeping child's brow. Christ whispers it knows you. You lean back against the trunk, and the tree hums not music, not speech. Memory. You see moments not in your past, but in others. An elderly man forgiving his brother on his deathbed. A girl feeding her enemy after the war. A mother refusing to curse God after her child dies. And every time someone chose love where fear would have made more sense, the tree grew. You ask, is it finished? He laughs gently, not even close. You notice something tucked between two roots. A book. Worn, unlabeled. You open it. Blank pages. But when your fingers touch them, words appear. You are part of the growing. You close the book slowly. Christ stands. One more story, he says. You nod. You ready? Always you answer. He smiles and gestures toward a clearing filled with soft grass and a faint scent of myrrh. You step into it. It's circular like an amphitheater made of light. And in the center, nothing, just space. You look at him. He gestures again. This, he says, is the place where stories are re-seen. You wait. He continues. There was once a person who thought they understood their past. You raise an eyebrow. But when they came here, he says the stories played differently. Pain showed its root. Joy showed its cost. Silence revealed its shape. You look around, and suddenly you see the moment you thought was abandonment was protection. The loss you hated opened the door to someone you now love. The prayer that went unanswered saved you from something you'll never know. And your knees go soft. Not from grief, from grace, because it all belonged, even the hardest parts, especially those. Christ touches your shoulder. This, he says, is the parable you don't tell. Why? Because it tells you remain still standing within that circle of re-seeing. The stories play softly around you, now no longer flashing like revelation, but weaving like lullabies. Each one hums with its own kind of quiet, the silence of being seen without needing to explain. Christ watches you, gently giving space for your breath to catch up with your heart. Then he turns, leading you into a grove, filled with a kind of light you've never known. It doesn't cast shadows. It doesn't have color. It simply knows. And in the center of this grove, nothing. No throne. No scroll. No angel. Just air. You glance at him, confused. He smiles. This, he says, was the day I taught, without a single word. You wait. And slowly the grove becomes aware. Not awakened. Aware. The trees lean. The light bends. The air holds its breath. He begins not with speech, but movement. He steps forward, touches his chest, then the ground, then stretches his hands outward. You feel it before you understand it. That gesture, that was welcome. Next, he closes his eyes, presses his palm gently to his lips. Gratitude. Then he kneels. Both hands open, empty. Surrender. You watch the movements become rhythm, and without trying, you begin to follow. You mirror him. Not exactly, but deeply. Like remembering a language you once spoke in the womb. And then, stillness. No final pause, no holy symbol. Just presence. He opens his eyes and finally speaks. They understood. You nod even before asking, who? A crowd, he says, tired, divided, distrustful. too bruised to believe, too guarded to ask. And they understood that you ask. He chuckles softly, not with their minds, with their bodies, their breath, their being. He sits cross-legged, motioning you to do the same. The story was never in the words he says, it was in the waiting. Some believe this parable refers to a real event lost to time, a silent gathering, where Christ said nothing, yet changed everything. Others think it's a metaphor for contemplation, where the soul learns without language. He says nothing else for a while, and it's enough. You sit with him in the grove of unspoken teaching, surrounded by the invisible presence of heaven that doesn't need to announce itself. Then finally he rises. There's no ceremony to it, just continuation. And you rise too? Because this is not a journey of steps. It's a story walking itself forward through you. He leads you into a clearing darker now. The light overhead is dim, like dusk in a dream. There's a door, standing alone, tall, wooden, old, and beside it a figure, but not one of the glowing hosts, not a saint, not a being wrapped in power, just tired eyes, a slouched posture, the gatekeeper again. You glance at Christ, but he gestures forward. The figure turns, and now you see. They're neither angel nor human. There's something in between. What is this, you ask? He answers quietly. The being who lets something in, or out. You step closer. The gatekeeper doesn't look at you, just beyond you, always beyond. There was once a threshold, Christ says, between what you expect and what is true. And this one, he nods to the gatekeeper, was tasked with holding it open, or shut. You ask, did they choose wrongly? Some would say yes, Christ answers. Others say they saved everything. You wait. There was a day, he continues, when something approached the gate. Not evil, not holy, just different. The gatekeeper hesitated. They looked for a sign, a command, a prophecy. None came. So they trusted their silence, Christ says, and let it through. You pause. What was it? He whispers you. You freeze. He adds a soul out of season, a light out of order, a story that didn't match the structure. You step back almost dizzy. I was the mistake. No, he says, you were the risk. Some believe this parable is about souls born to disrupt old systems, called to walk paths no map has drawn. Others think it's about divine permission, that not everything heaven allows is pre-approved. Some things are trusted. You look again at the gatekeeper. Their hands tremble slightly, but their eyes full of peace. They would make the same choice again? You ask, was it worth it? Christ looks at you. I'm still telling your story, he says, so I think, yes. The door ahead begins to glow faintly. But it's not your time to pass through. Not yet. You've got more stories to remember. You stand before the faintly glowing door heart, steady not from calm but from clarity. You're beginning to understand something unspoken. Not every threshold is meant to be crossed. Some are meant to be known. Christ walks slowly beside you, and the gatekeeper gives a final nod, not of farewell, but recognition. They still don't know if it was the right choice, he says. You glance over your shoulder, but they do it again. He smiles, which means it probably was. You continue walking the forest, thinning the sky, dimming, though not from nightfall. It feels more like you're moving through a memory that hasn't fully settled. And ahead, just beyond a stone ridge, a storm. But this one doesn't move. It waits. You stop. Christ steps forward, letting the silence hang before he speaks. There was once a storm, he says, that I did not calm. You blink. Didn't we already? He cuts in gently. No, that was my storm. You pause. This one, he says, is yours. And then he begins the story. There was once a soul who was loved deeply, he says. So deeply that heaven allowed them to walk through a storm without rescue. You stiffen slightly. Because you know this one. He continues. Everyone around them prayed, cried, tried. But the winds did not cease. The waves did not part. You whisper why. Because the storm wasn't punishment, Christ says. It was permission. Permission for what? To walk through something that no one could explain. And still choose to love me after. You feel a lump rise in your throat. This storm had no purpose that could be printed on a page. No lesson that could be packaged in a sermon. No neat bow. Only pain. And yet, you made it through. Maybe barely. Maybe bitter. But breathing. And when they came out the other side, Christ continues, they did not shout or teach or testify. They just stood, quiet and strong. You feel tears rising not from grief, from being known. Some believe this parable is about the trials that shape without applause, those seasons of unexplainable suffering. Others think it's about trust, that real faith is forged not in rescue, but in remaining. You ask, what did heaven do? Christ answers, heaven wept, and then remembered. You see now clouds still hang above you, but they no longer frighten. they honor. This was your storm, and it didn't break you. Christ turns and gestures toward a gentle hill nearby, where a small lantern flickers in the wind. And next to it, a coin, suspended in the air, spinning slowly like it's waiting for something to decide. You both walk toward it. The wind doesn't touch the coin. It's suspended in stillness. This, he says, is the coin that never landed. He begins again. There was once a question, he says, so sacred that it could not be answered, only carried. And that question was, why me? The coin had been flipped, but no one watched it fall. No one caught it. It stayed in the sky mid-spin, glowing faintly. Some say it's fate, Christ says. Others say it's chance. He grins, but I say it's freedom. You frown. Freedom. The freedom to not be defined by the answer, he says, but by what you become in the waiting. Some believe this parable is about acceptance, that not every question needs a conclusion. Others think it's about living in the tension that peace can exist even when clarity does not. You watch the coin hover, it doesn't drop, and you're okay with that. Finally, Christ walks to a bench stone weathered older than anything you've seen. He sits and pats the space beside him. When you sit, he says, want to know what heaven misplaces? You raise an eyebrow. He smiles wide. Laughter. You laugh startled. What? There was once a burst of joy so pure, he says, it flew beyond the stars and never came back. Is that allowed? He shrugs. Heaven's not about control. He adds, it's still out there somewhere. A sound waiting to return. You pause. And if it does? He grins. The angels say that's when the story ends. You breathe it in. Maybe heaven does lose things. Not carelessly, but playfully. Like tucking a joy into the folds of time so that one day, maybe today, it might surprise you again. You look up at the stars. You almost hear it. That laugh. Familiar. Yours. You sit with Christ under a sky that feels closer than before, like it's leaning in, curious, listening, gentle. The coin still spins faintly above you, untouched by gravity, never choosing heads or tails. But it no longer asks to be resolved. And neither do you. Christ rises from the stone bench. His gaze moves past the field toward a darker horizon. Not ominous, just deeper. The kind of darkness that holds what hasn't yet been revealed. You follow his eyes. Then you hear it. Not wind. Not thunder. Breath. Long. Slow. Ancient. He begins again, his voice low. There was once a fire, he says, that left no ashes. You nod. I remember. He smiles. And there was once a storm that I never calmed. You remember that too. But this one, he says, pointing toward the horizon, was never meant to stop. You turn toward it. The storm that never needed to be calmed, he whispers. And the story begins. There was once a woman, he says, who prayed every day for peace. Her life was quiet, but her heart was not. She asked for calm seas, smooth roads, answers. But what she received, he continues, was interruption. Plans shifted, loved ones changed, dreams bent. Nothing stayed the same for long. And so she stopped asking for peace, he says, and started listening to the storm. At first she resisted it, tried to organize it, name it, even tame it. But one day, he says, she sat in the middle of it and let it pass through her. And she didn't drown, he says, she sang. A soft wind moves through the grass. You feel it not as cold or warning, but as welcome. Some believe this parable is about grief, that the storm of it isn't meant to be silenced, but sung through. Others say it's about accepting life's unanswered parts and making art with them. You close your eyes. You've done this. Sat inside something messy and real and terrifying and didn't run. Christ continues, there's a faith that stops storms. And there's a faith, he says slowly, that walks into them barefoot humming. You open your eyes. The horizon darkens. But this time, you step forward. Not as a test, as a witness. He walks with you, and the storm does not scatter. It makes room. A path opens, not dry, not safe, but sacred. Rain falls upward. Lightning pulses like heartbeat. And through it all you remain. You pass through into a new stillness. Not after the storm, inside it. And in that quiet, Christ says, you're almost ready. You ask for what? He turns to you, the parable that you tell. You pause. But I've been living it this whole time. He nods. Yes, but you haven't spoken it. A field stretches ahead, blank and open. At its center is a single flame, small, hovering just above the ground. You recognize it. From before. The fire that left no ashes, you whisper. But this time it's waiting. Christ gestures, and you step toward it. The flame pulses gently as you approach, and you realize this fire doesn't burn what's given. It reflects it. Christ says, speak, not with your mouth, with your memory. You kneel, and the parable rises from you, not as a story you invent, but as the truth you've been, the ache you carried that became a doorway, the silence that taught you to sing, the unanswered prayer that led you here. The flame receives it and does not consume it. It becomes it, and in its glow you see someone else's eyes, watching, listening. Not far from you, a future listener. Your parable will find them, not today, but someday. Some believe this is how heaven shares stories, not by speaking but by becoming. Others say this is how the gospel lives on, not just in words, but in those willing to let their lives glow without catching fire. You stand, lighter than before. Christ places a hand on your shoulder and nods toward one final path. It leads upward and inward. He says it's time to laugh. You smile confused, but he just adds, the first laugh was joy. This one is victory. The path ahead is golden, but not from gold. It's lit by memory. Not just yours, everyone's. It glows like laughter left behind in empty rooms, the kind that lingers long after joy has moved on. You feel it in your bones before you understand it with your mind. Christ walks slowly, reverently. This isn't the laugh of lightheartedness. It's older, wiser, deeper. He stops beside a small hill, not tall, not grand, just familiar. At its peak sits a bench. On the bench a robe. No one wears it. Yet somehow it still feels worn. This, Christ says, is the seat of the first laugh in heaven. You raise an eyebrow. Didn't we already hear that laugh? He smiles. You heard the echo. This is the beginning. He sits on the grass and you follow. Then he begins. There was once a moment, he says, before creation, before time, before the fall, when everything that would ever be existed only in thought. You close your eyes and feel it. Low, powerful, hopeful. And in that moment, he continues the thought of you passed through the mind of God. And heaven laughed. Not with mockery, not with amusement, but with delight. That sound, pure, round, full of fire and light, burst through eternity like a song that knew it would one day be sung aloud. The angels didn't understand it, he says, because laughter didn't exist yet, but they felt it, and they waited. The robe on the bench shifts slightly in the wind. It seems to breathe. The first laugh, Christ says, was God seeing you, before you fell, before you doubted, before you wept. It was the recognition of your beauty, of your becoming. You sit very still, because this laugh isn't meant to be heard. It's meant to be remembered. Some believe this parable points to the pre-existence of the soul, that deep divine knowing before birth. Others say it's about the kind of joy only heaven can have, joy in what will be long before it is. You ask, does God still laugh like that? Christ grins every time someone becomes what they were always meant to be. You exhale, because for the first time in a long time, you're not chasing meaning. You're resting in it. He continues. There was once a boy who cried every night believing he was disappointing heaven. You nod. You know that feeling. But one day Christ says he heard laughter in a dream. He thought it was cruel, so he covered his ears. But the laughter didn't mock him, it called him. It reminded him of the joy that existed before his failure. He woke up smiling. You look up at the stars now, they don't shimmer, they giggle. You chuckle and Christ smiles. Do you hear it now, he asks. You nod, it's in everything. He stands again. The robe on the bench stays. It's not his, it's yours. But not yet. You'll wear it later, he says, when laughter fits you again. You ask, and now? He looks ahead, to a path lined with books. Scrolls, ink that drips upward, words that write themselves. It's time, he says, to speak the parable no one else can say. You pause. What is it? He turns to you, eyes gentle. It's the one you've already begun, but never believed anyone would want to hear. You step toward the page waiting for you. Blank, glowing, open. And Christ says, let's write it together. You stand before the page. It floats, no strings, no pulpit, no pressure. Just space waiting to be filled. Its surface shimmers with anticipation, as if it already knows what's coming, but respects your right to write it slowly. Christ stands beside you silent, not because he has nothing to say, because you do. You glance at him unsure. He gives the faintest nod. So you begin, not with a pen, not with your mouth, with memory, with breath, with a heartbeat that doesn't need to be perfect to be holy. The page drinks in your story not linearly, not neatly. It doesn't demand paragraphs. It welcomes pauses, tear stains, half-formed truths. It understands. Christ smiles. This is the parable no one else can speak, he says, because no one else has lived you. You nod slowly. He continues softly now. There was once a soul who never fit in, not for lack of trying, but because their shape was sacredly strange. They were too quiet for the loud, too loud for the silent, Too broken for the strong, too strong for the broken. They walked crookedly until they discovered they'd been dancing the whole time. You feel your hands trembling, not with fear, with release. He places one hand over yours. You've always carried the story, he says. Now it carries you. Some believe this parable is about authenticity, the divine fingerprint no one else shares. Others say it's about embracing the chapters of your life you once tried to erase. You glance at the page again. It has shape now. It glows in places, sinks in others. You see, the moment you nearly gave up but whispered one more prayer. The person who broke you, and unknowingly opened something inside. The day you chose softness over spite. The time you forgave yourself for the thing you swore you never would. All of it. There, alive. You ask, does everyone get to do this? Christ's voice wraps around you like a quiet song. Yes. Then why do so few? He looks away, then back at you. Because they were taught to hide their pages. The words pierce gently, like a needle mending fabric instead of tearing it. They think heaven only wants the polished, he continues, but I came for the torn. He gestures to the page again. You can stop editing now. You swallow hard, because you know what he means. You've been revising your own story for years, trimming the pain, rewriting the truth, cropping the sorrow to fit someone else's theology. But now, the page asks for honesty. So you let it out. The doubt, the questions, the moments you prayed out of obligation, not hope, the things you never got closure for, the things that still hurt. The page accepts it all, doesn't flinch, doesn't correct. It remembers. Christ places his hand on the center of the glowing script, and the letters bloom. They rise into the air like scent from a flower that waited years to open. And in that scent, you feel the parable become part of the sky. No one else will ever read it. But all of heaven will know it by heart, because it's yours. He leans close, his voice barely above breath. I've written on mountains, on hearts, in dust. But your page is my favorite. You close your eyes. A single tear falls. Not from sadness, from surrender. He takes the glowing page now complete and folds it gently, then presses it into your chest. You don't feel paper, you feel belonging. You ready, he asks? For what? He smiles. To return. Return. The word settles differently now. It doesn't sound like going back, it sounds like going in. You look at Christ. His eyes are soft with something you've begun to recognize as holy mischief. Like he knows exactly what's about to happen, but loves letting you figure it out in your own time. You ask return to where? He turns slowly and begins walking. Not to the world you left, he says, but to the world that waited for you. You follow. The path begins to twist, not backward, not forward, but spiraled. Like a staircase that has forgotten how to ascend and simply exists to turn inward. Most people think they leave heaven, Christ says, but really they return from it with pieces still stuck to their skin. You glance down at your arms. They shimmer faintly, not glowing remembering. He continues. There was once a child who asked me, why can't I stay? And what did you say? Christ smiles. I told her because someone down there is praying for you. You breathe in sharply. Some believe this parable is about birth, that souls come from a place not of beginning but of remembering. Others say it's about mission, that every return carries a seed of restoration. You reach a grove filled with mirrors. None of them reflect you. Instead, they show people you've loved, hurt, helped, ignored, saved. Some flash by in an instant. Others stay. You see someone you haven't thought of in years, someone you disappointed. And the mirror doesn't judge. It invites. Christ says you can't return without honoring where you've been. You step into the reflection not to fix anything, not to relive it, to see it rightly. The mirror ripples and fades. You keep walking. The spiral deepens now. The light changes, not brighter, nearer. And then, you see a chair? Old. Worn. Yours. Not metaphorically. Yours. From your life. The one in the corner where you used to cry when no one understood you. The one you prayed in, doubted in, fell asleep in. It's been waiting, and it's here, in heaven. Christ gestures. You sit. The chair sighs beneath you like an old friend happy to feel your weight again. Then he says there was once a soul who forgot why they came. They asked for signs, for clarity, for a reason. But what they received was a person. You glance up. Who you ask? He leans closer. You blink. I don't. He stops you gently. They came for you, he says, to see how light lives in your hands, how pain doesn't drown your praise, how your silence still sings. You sit back. Because you've been waiting to matter for so long you didn't realize. You already do. Some believe this parable is about incarnation, not just Christ's, but ours. That we are stories made flesh sent to reintroduce love to a world that forgot its name. Christ stands. The chair vanishes behind you like fog burned off by morning. And now the spiral begins to unwind. Not erase, expand. The path opens, and far ahead you see something rising. Not a city, not a garden, a table. Christ grins. You've got one more meal. You laugh. Didn't we already do the silent banquet? This one's different, he says. This one has names. You walk. The spiral flattens, becomes horizon, and beyond it 1,000 places you've touched without knowing. 1,000 people who've carried echoes of your life without ever saying your name. And they are waiting. For you, the horizon parts like a curtain made of time, and beyond it the table waits. Longer than you can see, yet not endless. It has edges, not limits, borders, but not barriers. The wood is warm, worn, and alive like it remembers every hand that ever rested upon it. You and Christ approach from a gentle rise. No trumpet sounds, no angelic choirs. Just quiet, a holy quiet, the kind that invites breath instead of applause. You pause at the edge. He nods. So you step forward. There are names carved into the wood, some in your language, some in others, some in symbols you don't recognize, but feel familiar. And in the center of the table, a space carved with no name, but it's yours. Not empty, waiting. This, Christ says, is the table of the unseen fruit. You tilt your head, fruit. He smiles. The kind you planted but never witnessed grow. You blink slowly, and the parable begins. There was once a gardener, he says, who was told to sow without guarantee. They planted prayers that never felt heard, acts of kindness forgotten the next day, seeds of grace in soil that never seemed to soften. You feel this one already. They kept going, he says, not because they saw results, but because they loved the ground. And then one day, they died, Christ says. You freeze. And when they arrived here, he continues, they found this table, and it was full. Each fruit bore the echo of a moment the gardener thought was wasted, a word spoken in weariness that prevented a stranger's despair, a forgiveness whispered alone that broke a generational curse, a moment of holding your own anger that shaped someone's future gentleness. They never saw the harvest, he says, but heaven did. You look around. The table is full of fruit, but not the kind from Eden. These glow, pulse, some hum with music, some shift into colors you've never seen before. And then something impossibly tender happens. People begin to arrive, not grandly, just naturally. Some you recognize, most you don't. They sit and smile at you. Christ nods. They're here because of what you did, that you forgot. You glance down. One of them is holding a fragment of your parable, the one you spoke into the fire. They don't say anything. They just breathe easier. Some believe this parable is about legacy, not fame, but the holy residue of a life lived honestly. Others say it's about faithfulness, the quiet kind, the daily kind, the kind that heaven collects even when earth does not. You sit at your space. It's warm, as if someone's been saving your place this whole time. And on your plate, one piece of fruit. Unfamiliar. You touch it and see a moment when you almost turned bitter, but didn't. You bite in. And the taste, like memory, like forgiveness, like home. You look at Christ. He raises a glass. You raise yours. The table flickers, not vanishing, not ending, just folding gently into the next mystery. He leans towards you. There's a final path, he says. You ask to where? To the place where the last story waits. And after that, he smiles. Nothing, then adds, which is the beginning. You rise from the table slowly, as if to avoid waking something sacred that still lingers in the air. The other guests remain seated, not frozen, not unaware, just content. Their eyes follow you not with longing, but with quiet blessing. They know your journey isn't over. Christ walks ahead. No urgency, just invitation. The path now is soft, not made of soil or stone, but something quieter, like a woven fabric of prayer and sleep. It cushions your steps like your presence has been anticipated here. He leads you toward a clearing you almost recognize. It isn't memory, it's origin. At the center is a pool, still, dark, reflective but not of your face. You see stories, yours, and others, twisting together like threads in water. And beside the pool, a scroll. But unlike the scroll from before, this one is sealed, bound with a single ribbon of light pulsing faintly. Christ stops. and looks at you with an expression that carries both joy and gravity. This, he says, is the final parable. You wait. He doesn't open the scroll. He begins without it. There was once a soul who thought they had come to learn, he says. But they had come to remember. They believed they were being changed, but really they were being revealed. You close your eyes, and in the darkness behind your eyelids, you see it, your first prayer, your last breath, your oldest ache, your unspoken hope, all resting in the same cup. And one day Christ continues, that soul arrived at the edge of their journey only to discover. He pauses, not for effect, for reverence, that they were the story God told before anything else was made. You open your eyes. The scroll is glowing brighter. You ask, "Can I open it?" He smiles. It's already open. You've been reading it for some time now. Some believe this parable is about divine authorship, that your life was never random but rhythmic. Others say it speaks to unity, how all lives echo from one breath, one voice, one sacred longing. Christ gestures to the pool. You kneel beside it, and the story's flickering on its surface slow, until only one remains. Yours, but it's not just your life. It's your parable. You speak the first line aloud. There was once a child who could not sleep, so God told them a story. The pool ripples. Christ watches you gently. That story became their path, their wounds, their joy, their resistance, their return. The pool darkens again, and then stills. It's done. And you feel it, not the end, the fullness. Christ steps beside you, places the scroll in your hands. It is weightless, and then dissolves into light, folds into your chest, and settles behind your heartbeat. You ask, "What now?" He exhales slowly, and for the first time you realize he's been walking you toward sleep this entire time. You've told your story, he whispers, and now it's time to rest. You lie down beside the pool. The ground is warm. It cradles you. Christ sits at your feet. His voice now is softer than breath. "One more step," he says. You ask where? To the wind down. He nods toward the dimming horizon. It's time to let the story fade. The pool behind you darkens gently, like eyes closing at the edge of a prayer. You rest on your side now, the scroll of your life folded softly behind your heartbeat. Each breath feels slower, fuller, less tethered to time. Christ sits near, no longer the guide, but the witness. You don't speak, not because there's nothing left to say, but because everything has already been said, and now it lives inside you. He looks up at the sky above the one you've walked beneath for what feels like forever, and speaks with a voice quieter than water falling on still leaves. There was once a light that didn't shine. You blink, and he smiles. Not because it was broken, but because it was waiting. For what you ask, for darkness deep enough to make it matter. You feel it now, your light. It doesn't glow outward, it glows through. And he continues. That light waited years to be kind to the one who hated it. Waited decades to forgive what was never apologized for. Waited lifetimes to see itself not as the answer, but as the quiet in between. You ask softly, and then Christ looks at you. It didn't explode, it didn't preach, it didn't conquer. It stayed. And in staying, it changed everything. Some say this parable is about hidden saints, those whose lives touched thousands, but were never known by name. Others say it's about you. Yes, you, not the version of you who finally got everything right, but the version who kept showing up anyway. You close your eyes, and the story softens, not fades, just settles, like light finally allowed to sleep. Now, let the story slow. Let the words you've gathered nestle quietly into the corners of your soul. There's no need to remember every detail. The story remembers you. Breathe in, softly. Feel how light your chest has become, how much softer your thoughts are now. The coin never landed. The gatekeeper still watches. The parable still unfolds. But for now, none of that needs your attention. Because here in this moment you are held by the laughter that preceded your first breath, by the silence that once answered your oldest prayer, by the one who walked with you across every vineyard, every storm, every unanswered chapter, and never once walked ahead to leave you behind. You don't have to finish anything tonight. You don't have to understand. You only have to rest. And as you drift, imagine this: a field lit by stars that remember your name, a tree whose roots hum the melody of every kind choice you've ever made, and a voice not outside you but inside whispering, "Well done, still becoming, still loved." Let that be your lullaby now. Let that be the closing chord of your soul's long exhale. The parable has paused, not ended. It sleeps beside you, patiently waiting for tomorrow's page. Good night, beloved storyteller. The light is still with you, always. End of script. Sweet dreams.